The wind screamed down Fifth Avenue like a warning, relentless and sharp, slicing through coats and scarves with no regard for wealth or poverty. New York City had a way of testing even its strongest inhabitants, and on that brutal January morning, it was merciless. Sidewalks shimmered with ice patches. Breath turned into fleeting clouds. Horns blared. Shoes clicked. Coffee steamed. And somewhere between all that motion, David White sat still, invisible, forgotten, as if he had never mattered. He was crouched on a piece of cardboard worn thin by the same boots that now crushed slush and salt around him. His back was pressed to the side of a closed shop, his knees drawn to his chest like a soldier in a foxhole, not for battle, but for warmth. His fingers, once strong and steady, were now brittle and shaking inside torn gloves. His coat, 2 sizes too small and missing half the zipper, flapped uselessly in the wind. David was 58 years old. Once, that number would have sounded wise. Now it sounded tired. His face was creased from a life of service and sorrow, his eyes sunken but not entirely empty. There was something still burning in them, quiet, maybe, but unextinguished. 8 months ago, David had an apartment in Queens. Nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom above a deli that always smelled like bacon grease and oregano. He had a job as a night security guard at a private logistics company. Not glamorous, but steady. He kept a thermos of coffee next to his chair, made rounds every 2 hours, and sometimes brought leftover bagels home to his cat, Winston. Then came the dizzy spells, the shortness of breath, the tightening in the chest that no aspirin could touch. The diagnosis came fast and unceremoniously, a genetic heart condition that had gone unnoticed for decades. Suddenly, the man who had guarded warehouses through rain, snow, and blackout was deemed a liability. He was let go with a nod and a severance check that barely lasted the month. Rent piled up. The landlord, sympathetic but firm, gave him 30 days. Winston was taken to a shelter. And then, as if the universe was determined to push him into the ground, he received a letter from the state police. His wife and daughter, who'd been driving upstate to visit family, had been killed in a head-on collision with a semi-truck on Route 17. The snowstorm that night made the roads slick. The other driver had survived. David's family had not. He didn't cry right away. It took days. The photo he now kept in a plastic sandwich bag, the 3 of them smiling at a lake in the Catskills, his daughter on his shoulders, his wife beaming in a red sundress, was all he had left that reminded him he was once someone's everything. Now, he was someone's nothing. The cold bit deeper. He adjusted the cardboard under his legs, already damp with moisture seeping through the cracks. A man in a navy coat walked past, holding a cup from a boutique coffee shop. David caught a whiff of cinnamon. His stomach responded with a violent twist. He hadn't eaten since the afternoon before last, and that had been a bruised banana from a food pantry. The soup kitchen on 41st wouldn't open until noon. For more hours. His breath fogged the photo in his hand. He wiped it gently, like a sacred artifact. People passed in waves, their eyes skimming over him like static. He no longer tried to speak. When he did, they pretended not to hear. He didn't blame them, not anymore. He used to be one of them. He used to walk this street in a navy blue uniform with a name tag and steel-toed boots, nodding to strangers, but never seeing the man on the ground. He hadn't known then what it felt like to vanish. A woman in heels clipped past, her briefcase bumping his knee. She didn't notice. David muttered an apology and drew his legs in tighter. Shame and cold had become interchangeable sensations now. He still wore his military dog tags beneath his shirt. U.S. Army, Staff Sergeant David White. Served in the Gulf. 20 years, multiple commendations. His knees had carried him through sandstorms, minefields, and deserts that cooked the flesh through Kevlar. But none of those places broke him like this city did. He shifted slightly, reaching into the side of his backpack. It was old, a military issue with the straps fraying and one zipper permanently stuck. Inside were all his worldly possessions, 2 extra pairs of socks, one with holes, a rain-soaked novel he never finished, a bottle of expired aspirin, a battered canteen, and a plastic bag with his wife and daughter's photo. On the outside flap was a patch that read, "No man left behind." David chuckled at that, a dry, humorless sound that was swallowed by the wind. No man left behind. Unless you couldn't pay rent. Unless you got sick. Unless the world moved on without you. He pulled his coat tighter and looked out at the avenue. He could tell the time by the flow of foot traffic. The early office workers had passed. The tourists with their lattes and shopping bags would come next. He avoided the public library steps, too exposed. He had found this corner near the subway because it offered a sliver of protection from the police and just enough visibility for passersby to maybe toss a coin. But he never asked. Not outright. That was a line he hadn't crossed. His pride, though bruised and cracked, still stood tall enough to keep his voice low. His stomach growled again. Loudly, he winced and pressed a hand against it. The kind of hunger that made your joints ache. That made your head swim. Just $1, he thought. Not even enough for a full coffee, but enough to buy a moment of warmth. A corner booth at the bodega. 5 minutes to breathe. 5 minutes to not feel like a ghost. He looked down at his hands. They didn't look like his anymore. The skin was cracked, nails dark from cold and dirt. His wedding ring still sat on the left one, a small band of silver with a dent from years of work. He turned it slowly. It had once shined. A gust of wind tossed a crumpled napkin toward him. He didn't flinch. Let the world throw what it wanted. Across the avenue, a commotion stirred. People slowed. Some lifted their phones. Security guards emerged, forming a perimeter. David craned his neck, squinting past the blur of winter light. And then he saw him. Elon Musk. The face he'd seen on screens, on newsstands, on covers of business magazines. Taller in person. Surrounded by handlers, but walking with intention, like someone who didn't like wasting time. David blinked. The cold was playing tricks. But no, it really was him. And for a reason David couldn't explain, his chest tightened. Not with fear, not with awe, but something else. Something closer to recognition. He didn't know why. He only knew that something inside him shifted. His heart pounded, not from illness, but from decision. Today he would ask, just $1, and it would change everything. David counted the coins in his pocket for the 5th time that hour. 24 cents. A dime, 2 nickels, and 4 pennies, not even enough for the cheapest cup of coffee in the city. He held the coins in his palm, staring at them as if sheer focus might multiply them. But they didn't. They never did. The metal was cold against his skin, just like everything else in this city that had turned its back on him. His stomach knotted and twisted, not just from hunger, though that was bad enough, but from the hollow ache of remembering. Hunger had a rhythm of familiarity. It was pain, yes, but also routine. What hit harder were the memories that snuck up in the quiet between footsteps and wind gusts. The echoes of a life that had once been his. He could almost hear his daughter's laughter, light and wild, as she chased leaves in Central Park during the fall. She would dart across the grass, her arms stretched like wings, pretending to be a bird or a superhero, whichever came to mind first. Her coat was always slightly too big, her scarf trailing behind like a cape. She had a laugh that rang out like a bell. His wife used to say it could warm up the whole world. He believed that. Then came the image of his wife, framed by the kitchen window, her hands deep in a bowl of soapy water, smiling at him as he buttoned up his uniform for the night shift. That smile, it wasn't just love. It was peace. It was partnership. She never once complained about his long hours, his sore feet, the unpredictable schedule. Instead, she'd pack him a small meal, always including a handwritten note tucked between a sandwich and a cookie. Be safe. Come home to us. He remembered reading those notes under the glow of flickering security monitors, alone in quiet warehouses filled with silence and shadows. That life had been simple, repetitive even, but it had been his. Now, the quiet was different. It wasn't a companion anymore. It was a predator stalking him from inside his own mind. David let the coins slide back into his coat pocket, their weight insignificant compared to the burden he carried. Around him, Life kept moving with relentless pace. People stomp along the icy pavement, their footsteps fast and purposeful. They talked into Bluetooth headsets, stared into glowing screens, and gripped paper coffee cups like lifelines. He watched one man in a tailored suit nearly walk into a lamppost because he was too busy scrolling through his phone. Another woman cursed under her breath when she spilled a few drops of her latte on her gloves. David sat still, observing it all. He had become so accustomed to his own invisibility that he no longer took offense. Invisibility was safer in some ways. No one looked, no one asked, no one judged. He was a smudge in their periphery, something to step around, like a crack in the sidewalk or a discarded flyer. A part of the background. He still hadn't spoken to anyone that day. Not a word. There had been a brief nod of thanks when someone dropped a wrapped granola bar near him earlier in the week, but otherwise, silence was his only companion. He guarded it like armor. Silence and dignity were all he had left that belonged entirely to him. He had never begged. Not once. Not out loud. That was his line in the sand. He'd served in uniform for 20 years. He'd led men in heat and fire. He'd held wounded comrades in his arms, fought off fear with grit, returned home with medals that now sat in some storage facility, collecting dust. What were they worth now? In this city, medals didn't buy meals. But they weren't the point. What mattered was that he'd kept his word, upheld his honor. But today felt different. The wind was crueler, the ache in his stomach deeper, and there was something else, a pressure, like the kind before a storm. Something unseen but undeniable. It pulsed in the back of his mind, made his heart beat a little faster. He glanced up from a sidewalk and squinted through the blur of snow and glass and motion. The street was full, like always. Office workers in black coats, tourists with bright scarves, street vendors yelling about hot dogs and roasted nuts. But in the middle of that ordinary chaos, someone caught his eye. It wasn't flashy. There were no flashing lights or dramatic music. Just a ripple in the flow of pedestrians. People slowing down, heads turning. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the temperature had changed. David's gaze followed the flow of movement, scanning past shoulders and scarves. Then he saw him. Tall, calm, moving with quiet certainty. Even from a distance, he recognized the face. He'd seen it on magazine covers, on screens in electronics stores, in news articles that always mentioned Mars, satellites, or electric cars. Elon Musk. There was no mistaking him. He wasn't surrounded by a massive entourage, just two men in dark coats walking a few paces behind, eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Elon didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He walked with a kind of presence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow gathered it anyway. David's heart skipped. It didn't make sense. Why would a man like that be here, walking past the entrance to a subway station in the middle of Manhattan? Why this corner? Why today? David felt the weight of the moment settle on him, like snowfall. Heavy, quiet, final. His hand instinctively went to his coat pocket, fingers brushing the coins again. 24 cents. Not even enough for coffee, but maybe, just maybe enough for something else. He didn't know why, but something told him this was his chance. His shot. Not at millions, not at miracles. Just a moment. Just one word. He licked his lips, dry from a wind. His hands trembled, though whether from cold or nerves, he couldn't tell. The line he had sworn never to cross, the asking, loomed before him. He thought of his daughter running through the leaves. His wife's last handwritten note, "Come home to us." He had no home, but maybe this was a way forward. Elon was getting closer now, steps away. David's chest tightened. His pride screamed at him to stay silent. But his hunger and something deeper called louder. He didn't need a speech. He didn't need a plea. Just 4 words. Can you spare $1? But he hadn't said them. Not yet. And Elon Musk hadn't seen him. Yet. The murmur began like a distant ripple, a change in the usual rhythm of the street. David had grown finely attuned to those shifts. He could tell the difference between a tourist asking for directions and a panhandler being shooed away. But this was something else. A subtle tremor in the city's flow, like a school of fish parting around an unseen force in the water. Heads began to turn. People slowed. Phones were raised discreetly at first, then shamelessly. It started near the subway entrance at 42nd and Vanderbilt. David shifted slightly, careful not to lose the little warmth his cardboard pad provided. He lifted his eyes, squinting through the cold air. Steam curled up from a nearby grate, swirling like ghosts around fast-moving legs. He couldn't see the source of the disturbance yet, but he could feel it coming closer, an energy tightly wound, steadily approaching. Then he saw them. Two men in dark coats walking in precise formation, eyes scanning the street with purposeful detachment. Not police, not tourists. Private security, David could tell instantly. He'd done the job long enough to recognize the subtle choreography, one slightly ahead, one just behind and to the side, communicating silently through minute gestures and glances. These weren't men who wandered. They moved with practiced discipline, clearing a path that wasn't forced but nonetheless obeyed. In the eye of their formation, walking calmly, as if unaware of the buzz he created, was Elon Musk. David felt his breath catch, not out of fandom, but recognition. He had seen that face 1,000 times on magazine covers and news segments. That slightly tousled hair, the calm, yet calculating expression, the tall, confident posture of someone constantly balancing the weight of several worlds. It was unmistakable. Elon wasn't speaking. He wasn't shaking hands or smiling for cameras. He was just walking, observing. His gaze drifted from storefronts to intersections, from delivery vans to cracked sidewalks, as if analyzing a massive, living system for flaws and potential. David stared, frozen, but not from the cold. There is something strange about seeing someone so distant, so untouchable, moving through the same concrete labyrinth he called home. It was surreal. The richest man in the world walking down a street where David had slept 2 nights ago under a busted awning, shielding himself from freezing rain with a pizza box. He expected to feel envy or resentment, emotions that had occasionally visited him when watching others walk by in coats that cost more than his old apartment's rent. But now, staring at Elon Musk, what David felt was familiarity. Not with the man himself, but with the expression on his face. There was a depth in Elon's eyes, measured, introspective, constantly processing. It wasn't pity or distraction or disinterest. It was engagement, as though he wasn't just seeing the city, but listening to it. And that's what triggered something unexpected in David's chest. It wasn't hope. He'd long since learned to silence hope. Hope was a candle in a hurricane. It danced for a moment, then vanished, leaving only darkness behind. Nor was it desperation. He was too tired even for that. It was something deeper, a murmur from within, a kind of alignment, like gears slipping into place after months of grinding misfires. Elon Musk's face reminded him of his daughter. Not physically, of course, but in the way he looked at the world. His daughter had been that way too, always watching with sharp, curious eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle no one else could see. At 12 years old, she had been more observant than most adults. Once during a family outing, she'd noticed a man struggling to carry groceries across an icy sidewalk. Before David could react, she'd already dashed over to help, her gloved hands reaching for the bags. "People don't have to ask if we're already paying attention," she told him afterward, proud and serious. Now, watching Elon move through the street, David saw that same instinct. That same rare ability to be truly present. The security guards scanned the sidewalk, and for a moment David thought one of them noticed him. His instinct told him to lower his gaze, to shrink into the background, as he always did. But this time he didn't. He held his position, his eyes fixed on the man at the center of the quiet storm. Elon was now less than 20 feet away. His pace was unhurried but deliberate. He wore a black wool coat, open at the collar, and gloves that looked like they were made for more than style. A soft mist from his breath curled in front of him with each exhale. David's heart was hammering, not from exertion, but from the conflict within. Something told him to get up, to stand, to do something he hadn't done in months. Ask. Not for a miracle. Not for a house or a job or a second chance. Just $1. $1. Enough to buy warmth in liquid form. Something hot to hold in his hands, to remind himself he was still human. But it wasn't just about the dollar anymore. It was about being seen. It was about risking what little dignity he had left in exchange for the possibility, however slim, that someone might acknowledge his existence. He braced his hands against the sidewalk and slowly began to rise. His knees groaned in protest, his back screamed, and the world tilted sideways as blood struggled to reach his brain fast enough. A blast of wind nearly knocked him over again, but he steadied himself with one hand against the wall. The pain in his joints was sharp, but it grounded him. Across the space between them, Elon kept walking. David opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His throat was bone dry, lips cracked. He tried again, whispering at first, then louder. "Excuse me." One of the security guards turned sharply. His hand moved subtly toward his coat, ready but not yet aggressive. Elon noticed the shift and paused. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and in that gap of time, something passed between them. Recognition, not of name or face, but of presence. Elon tilted his head slightly, and David felt his breath hitch again. He hadn't meant to speak. He hadn't planned to break his silence. But something in that gaze made him believe, if only for a heartbeat, that this man might actually listen. David had stood in deserts with bullets flying past his head. He had held the hands of dying soldiers and faced nights so black he feared the sun had gone out. But this moment of vulnerability was more terrifying than any war zone. He took a breath, forcing his voice to work. "Can you spare $1?" His voice was barely louder than the wind, but Elon Musk heard him, and he stopped walking. David's knees cracked like dry branches under his weight as he pushed himself off the icy ground. His legs, stiff from hours of stillness, moved with painful reluctance. A cold spike shot through his spine as he straightened, and for a moment, the world spun around him. Buildings twisted like carnival mirrors. The gray sky pulsed. He placed a trembling hand against the frigid brick wall behind him and steadied his breath, clenching his teeth to suppress the rising nausea. Hunger and cold, an ancient duo, merciless in tandem, had left his body on the edge of collapse. His heart pounded, not from fear but effort. Just standing had become a battle. And yet he stood. In the distance, the rhythm of the street pulsed on. Car horns, the distant rumble of subway trains, the crunch of boots on salted pavement. But in David's ears, there was only one sound, a voice. Her voice. Soft, resolute, unforgettable. "Never ask. Promise me." Sarah had said it from a hospital bed, her hands still warm in his, the machines around her blinking steadily like morbid timekeepers. It was after the first surgery, the one they believed would give her a few more years. It hadn't, but the words had stayed. David had promised. Of course he had. Promised like any proud husband would, still believing there'd be time to renegotiate that vow later. But later never came. Now the same city that once held their laughter in parks and kitchen windows bore down on him like a storm. And that promise, once a shield, now felt like a chain. He could feel the eyes of the security team narrowing in on him. The one closest to Elon Musk subtly shifted position, body tense, hand inching near his coat where a concealed weapon surely waited. It was instinct. David knew that from his own years in the field. No movement near a VIP went unnoticed. Still, he didn't sit back down. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. Something deeper pulled him forward, past the weight of pride, and into the fragile unknown. His eyes burned not from cold but memory. 12 years ago, on a different winter day, he and his daughter had been leaving a holiday concert at her school. She was still in her red scarf and mittens, cheeks flushed from excitement. They walked hand in hand, her chattering nonstop about the flute solo she loved. As they passed a corner, they saw a woman sitting on the curb, her clothes threadbare, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. David remembered slowing slightly, but continuing forward. He had already reached into his coat pocket for his car keys when he realized his daughter's hand had slipped away. He turned and saw her kneeling beside the woman, pulling 3 crumpled dollar bills from her coat pocket, her birthday money. She handed it over with both hands and the purest smile David had ever seen. When he'd asked her why she gave it all, she'd looked at him with those wide brown eyes and said, "If we can help and don't, what does that make us?" That sentence had embedded itself into his very soul, even when his soul felt like it was falling apart. And now it echoed again, louder than the wind, clearer than Sarah's warning. His feet shifted forward. The security guard nearest to Elon took a half step toward him, widening his stance, eyes locked on David's every move. A second guard raised a hand to his earpiece. David could tell they were ready to act, but not yet. He hadn't crossed that invisible line. He raised his empty hand slowly, palms forward, universal body language for "I'm not a threat." But it wasn't them he wanted to reach. It was the man behind them. Elon Musk hadn't yet turned to face him, but he was close enough to hear, close enough to see, close enough for David to do what he had never done before. His lips moved, but the words caught. His throat was like sandpaper. He tried again, but shame was a weight pressing against his chest, stealing his breath. His hands dropped a little, heavy with hesitation. He glanced down at his feet, worn boots with split soles, laces tied in mismatched knots. His dignity was thin, thinner than the gloves he wore, but not gone. It was time. He drew a breath, slow and painful, and lifted his eyes. And again, he saw his daughter, not in her face this time, but in her heart. In the reminder she had given him years ago that had returned now, urgent and needed. It wasn't begging. Not if you asked because you truly had no other choice. Not if asking could mean one more day to try again. With every ounce of strength left in his battered frame, he whispered the words that felt like stone in his mouth. "Sir, may I?" The words failed again. He swallowed hard. His chest ached. Then he tried once more, voice scratchy and faint. "Could you spare $1?" It was barely above a whisper, but in the space around him, it carried weight like thunder. It was a rupture in the narrative of his silence. A surrender, yes, but also an act of courage. The act of a man who had nothing left to protect except his life. The guard closest to Elon moved immediately, stepping to shield his boss, but Elon paused mid-step. His gaze shifted toward the sound. Their eyes met. David couldn't describe the expression he saw. It wasn't shock. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, recognition maybe, connection. Time slowed. He expected Elon to keep walking, to nod politely, to offer a vague promise and move on. But instead, Elon Musk stopped. Not abruptly, not performatively. He simply stopped, and in doing so, shifted everything. David took a step, then another. Each footfall felt like dragging a mountain across a frozen field. His legs trembled, knees wobbling beneath the weight of 1,000 yesterdays. The world around him became a blur of sound and motion, murmurs rippling through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Phones were lifted higher. Curious onlookers leaned in, their breath turning to clouds in the morning chill. Some pointed, some whispered, some simply stared. But David didn't see them. Not really. His focus, narrowed and sharp, locked onto one man. Elon Musk stood just ahead, mid-stride, tall and composed. A man who had disrupted industries, who'd spoken about reaching Mars and wiring the human brain into machines. And yet, in this moment, he was simply a figure in a black coat, waiting on a question. David's breath caught in his throat. His heart raced not with excitement, but with fear raw and bone deep. The fear of rejection, the fear of exposure, the fear of what it meant to be vulnerable in front of so many watching eyes. He was no longer just a man on the sidewalk. He was a man on a stage he never asked to step onto. He opened his mouth, but shame clamped his jaw shut. What if Elon ignored him? What if the guards dragged him away? What if he'd already lost the last fragment of pride he clung to? The words swelled and stuck. He wanted to apologize, wanted to vanish. But then, for a reason he couldn't explain, he looked at Elon again. The man hadn't moved. He hadn't turned away. He was still there, gaze steady, present. And in that stillness, David found a thread of courage. The voice that came out wasn't strong. It wasn't rehearsed. It cracked like old wood and scraped like sand. "Excuse me, sir," he managed, barely louder than a whisper. Could you spare $1?" It was the simplest question a person could ask. Yet for David, it carried the weight of war, grief, and survival. It was not a plea. It was not a performance. It was a quiet unraveling of every promise he'd made to himself to never need. Never ask. Time seemed to falter. The ambient city noise faded, the honking cars, the rattling subway, the conversations of passers-by, all replaced by an eerie hush. Even the wind, once howling, seemed to hold its breath. One of the security guards reacted instantly. He shifted his stance and placed a firm hand on the radio at his shoulder, prepared to signal a potential breach. His eyes were locked on David, trained, evaluating. Was this man a threat? A distraction? A setup? David didn't flinch. He kept his hands raised slightly, open and empty. His eyes never left Elon's. Then, slowly, Elon Musk lifted his right hand and spoke. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm low, but firm enough to cut through the silence. "Give us a moment." The security team hesitated, caught between protocol and obedience. The one with the radio furrowed his brow, but dropped his hand. Another subtly widened the perimeter, keeping eyes on the crowd while stepping aside just enough to let David come closer. And in that space, barely 10 feet across, framed by two very different lives, a conversation began. David didn't speak right away. The cold, still gnawed at his bones, and the gravity of what he'd just done lingered like static in the air. His hand trembled slightly at his side. His voice had come out so small, so fragile, and yet it had been enough. Elon turned fully now, facing him, his posture relaxed but attentive. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't look past David or through him. He looked at him. And that single gesture, in a city where people couldn't be bothered to make eye contact, carried more power than any dollar bill ever could. David cleared his throat, his mouth dry as winter bark. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I've never asked before. Not like this." Elon's expression didn't shift to pity. He nodded slightly, encouraging without interrupting. David looked down, suddenly hyper-aware of his boots, the holes, the dampness, the smell. He took a half step back. I was a soldier," he said. "Security after that. Lost the job. Then the apartment. Then my wife and daughter years ago, but it's still all part of it, I guess." Elon's eyes flicked briefly to the dog tag visible under the frayed collar of David's coat. He read the name. "David White," Elon said softly. "U.S. Army." David nodded. "Yes, sir. 20 years. Elon didn't respond with praise or platitudes. He just held that gaze, unshaken, as if letting the words settle where they needed to. The crowd had grown again. People were now filming openly, murmuring in waves. The security detail stood tensely, hands hovering close to radios and earpieces, but none moved. Something unusual was happening, and everyone knew it. But no one understood it yet. Elon broke the silence again. "Why today?" he asked. "Why ask now?" David looked up. That was the question, wasn't it? Why today after months of silence? After years of guarding his pride like treasure? Why now? "I don't know," David admitted, his voice rough. "Maybe because you look like someone who might actually hear me." Elon tilted his head, not out of confusion, but contemplation. David continued, slower now. "You reminded me of my daughter. She used to see people, really see them. When she gave her birthday money to a woman on the street, I asked her why. She said, 'If we can help and don't, what does that make us?'" Elon's face didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Not sadness, not pity, recognition. There was a pause, a breath between two souls standing on either side of a social chasm. And then Elon did something no one expected. He took a step forward, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man listening to another man. And in that movement, everything shifted. Elon took a measured step forward, closing the distance with a calm that contrasted sharply with the stir in the crowd behind him. David stood still, his breath shallow, heart pounding like a drum muffled by years of silence. Despite the cold, sweat began to bead along the back of his neck, a strange sensation given the icy wind. He braced himself, unsure of what might come next. A dismissive nod, a polite smile followed by a retreat. Instead, Elon's eyes locked on him, not darting or evaluating, but really seeing him. "You're a veteran?" Elon asked, his voice steady, gesturing subtly to the cracked and faded military ID tag clipped to David's coat. David nodded, his back instinctively straightening. "Yes, sir. Captain David White. Gulf War." The words came out almost automatically, the formality deeply embedded after 2 decades of service. His voice carried the weight of a life lived by protocol and precision, but also one that had been cracked open by grief and hardship. Elon didn't respond immediately. He examined the tag for a moment longer, then looked back at David with a gaze that held no pity, only curiosity and something gentler, harder to define. Compassion, perhaps. Respect. "I've seen you this week," Elon said quietly, as if it were a private conversation despite the dozen phones aimed in their direction. "You read the newspaper that someone leaves on the bench near the subway entrance. Every morning." David blinked, confused. You noticed that?" Elon nodded. "You helped a woman pick up her groceries when her bag broke on Monday." David's brow furrowed. "I didn't think anyone saw that." "I saw," Elon said simply. "And I saw that you never ask for anything. Not once. You just sit there. Quiet. Dignified." David didn't know how to respond. His instinct was to brush it off, say something self-deprecating, make a joke maybe, but this wasn't a man looking for false humility. Elon wasn't trying to make him feel better. He was just stating what he had observed. Truthfully, directly. There was a pause, not awkward but weighty, the kind of pause that invites honesty to step into the room. "Why today?" Elon asked then, his voice even quieter, not out of discretion, but because the question itself held gravity. "Why now?" David's lips parted slightly. He wasn't prepared for the question, though perhaps he should have been. His eyes drifted to the sidewalk, then back up to the man in front of him. Not the billionaire, not the inventor, not the celebrity, but the man. He could have given a dozen logical answers, the cold, the hunger, the hopelessness pressing in from all sides. But none of those were the truth behind this moment. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Because," he paused, and when the words didn't come easily, he pushed through anyway. "Because you reminded me of my daughter." Elon's face didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "She was 12 when we lost her," David continued. "Same age, maybe, as your son when I saw his photo last. Smart kid, always watching, always paying attention." He paused, breath catching on the memory. "She used to do things like you, noticing people, things others overlooked. One time, she gave all her birthday money to a woman on the street. I asked her why, and she said, 'If we can help and don't, what does that make us?'" The words lingered in the cold air, floating between them. Elon didn't respond right away. The noise of the city seemed to fade, swallowed by the quiet weight of what had just been said. For the first time in a long time, David felt that someone wasn't rushing to move on, wasn't looking for an exit. Elon simply stood there, absorbing, acknowledging. There was a subtle change in Elon's posture. His shoulders, always squared with a kind of unspoken burden, now seemed more relaxed, as if the story had reached something within him that lived beneath the surface. The murmuring crowd, though still present, faded into irrelevance. The cameras didn't matter. The earpieces, the phones, the expectations, none of it mattered in this thin slice of time. They stood there, 2 men from opposite ends of the world, one a captain who had lost everything, the other a titan who seemingly had it all, bound together by a story, a daughter, and the simple human need to be heard. David could feel the burn behind his eyes, but he held it. Not because he was ashamed to cry, not anymore, but because he didn't want this moment to be overtaken by emotion. It was too precise, too sacred. Elon looked down for a moment, thoughtful. When he raised his head again, His expression was unreadable, but not cold. He looked at David as one looks at someone telling a hard truth, with reverence. Then, for a full 5 seconds, he said nothing. And in that silence, David felt something shift. Not in the world. It kept spinning as chaotically as ever. But in himself. In this silence, David wasn't invisible. He wasn't forgotten. He was seen. Elon reached into the deep pocket of his coat with practiced ease, pulling out a sleek black smartphone that seemed almost too polished for the gritty street they stood on. There was no fanfare, no raised voice, no showmanship, just a quiet shift in energy, like a lever being pulled beneath the surface of the city. The simple act of retrieving his phone changed the air around them. The crowd, already murmuring with speculation, leaned in unconsciously. Security guards tensed, readjusting positions and scanning the surroundings. "Mr. White," Elon said, his tone both respectful and efficient. "Would you mind waiting here a moment? I need to make a call." David, still unsure if the entire encounter was real or some hunger-induced hallucination, nodded slowly. His mouth opened, perhaps to ask a question or to decline, out of habit more than reason, but no sound came. He merely nodded again, smaller this time. Elon had already stepped a few paces away, one hand holding the phone to his ear, the other reaching for a thin black tablet that a guard handed him wordlessly. The movement was fluid, habitual. Elon's fingers tapped the screen with the quiet authority of someone who had made decisions worth billions in just a few swipes. And yet, he wasn't rushing. He wasn't trying to escape the moment or the man who had interrupted his morning. He was staying. He was acting. David watched, still rooted to the icy sidewalk, as Elon spoke into the phone. "I need the property manager at the tower." "Yes, it's urgent." "No, everything's fine. But I need a favor." His voice was steady and low, but it carried enough force to part the air. David had been around enough commanding officers to recognize the tone. Not one of entitlement, but of precision. Elon knew what he wanted, and he was already orchestrating the means to achieve it. David's hands twitched slightly at his sides, the cold now secondary to the overwhelming sense of unreality. A man like Elon Musk, one of the most influential people on the planet, was making calls because of him. Because he had spoken. Because he had asked. It wasn't the attention that unsettled him most, it was the shift. For years, he had been background noise, a fixture on the edge of society's vision. Now, the city itself seemed to have turned, even if just slightly, and looked him in the face. He could feel it in the stares. The group of onlookers, which had grown from a few curious pedestrians to nearly a dozen, still hovered on the fringes. Some held their phones high, recording. Others simply watched, their expressions ranging from confusion to admiration to skepticism. One woman in a tailored coat whispered something to her friend and pointed toward David with a gloved hand. He resisted the urge to step back, to shrink into the anonymity that had become his shield. But something told him not to. Something in the way Elon had said Mr. White, as if he were a man with an office, a history, a future, made David hold his ground. The security team remained vigilant. One of the men, earpiece firmly in place, kept glancing between Elon and the crowd. His posture betrayed the inner conflict between respecting his client's request for space and maintaining the invisible wall of protection they were trained to uphold. Another stood near David, not confrontational, but definitely alert. David lowered his gaze for a moment and caught sight of his own boots. The leather was cracked beyond repair, the soles worn thin. In another time, he might have been embarrassed. But now, all he felt was wonder. These boots had carried him through deserts and deployments, hospital waiting rooms and eviction notices, and now they had carried him here, to a moment he never could have predicted. Elon was still speaking, now with a more measured cadence, walking slowly in a small circle near the edge of a sidewalk. His eyes darted between the screen and his surroundings, his voice rising and falling with the kind of restrained intensity that suggested plans were already taking shape. David's mind swirled with questions. What was he asking for? What could he possibly be arranging that required the property manager of one of the most iconic towers in the world? And why? Why would someone like Elon Musk care? The answer, David realized, wasn't something he could quantify. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even about duty. It was something simpler and more profound. Someone had noticed. Someone had listened. And not just anyone, someone who had the power to do something about it. The crowd remained respectfully distant, but the buzz had intensified. A few younger bystanders were openly live streaming, their breath fogging up the corners of their phone screens. Words like Elon, homeless guy, what's happening, floated around David like snowflakes. Still, Elon paid no attention to them. His entire focus remained locked in his phone, in his tablet, in the task at hand. David felt a strange pressure rise in his chest. Not fear, not grief, but something dangerously close to hope. He hadn't let himself feel that in years. Hope was dangerous. Hope got people hurt. But here it was anyway, stretching in his lungs like something that had been asleep for too long. He glanced up again, just in time to see Elon give a subtle nod to someone on the other end of the call. His expression remained composed, but his eyes had a new intensity to them, as if pieces were falling into place. David didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't even know what the next hour would look like. But right now, on this frozen strip of Manhattan concrete, Elon Musk was making a call on his behalf. And that in itself was enough to change everything. Elon returned to David's side, the phone still pressed to his ear, but his attention clearly on the man in front of him. The sharp rhythm of his voice from earlier was now softer, more personal, less the cadence of a tech magnate giving orders, and more the tone of a man reaching out. First, he began, his voice low but distinct. "I've arranged a room for you at one of our hotels, just 3 blocks from here. It's warm, it's clean, and it's yours for the next month. No conditions. Everything is covered." David blinked. For a second, he thought he had misheard. A room? A hotel room. Elon continued before David could even begin to form a response. "Second," he said, glancing briefly at the tablet in his other hand, "I spoke with our HR department. There's an opening for a security consultant at the tower. It's mostly desk work, reviewing protocols, training new staff. No heavy lifting, no patrols. Just your experience, your insight, and your presence." He looked David in the eye. "They'd like to interview you today at 2 o'clock, if you're up for it." David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His thoughts raced, spiraling into disbelief. An interview? A job? Today? After months of rejection, of being too old, too sick, too invisible? But Elon wasn't finished. "Third," he said, "I called the Manhattan VA. They're expecting you tomorrow morning for a full medical checkup. It's already arranged, no cost to you. Our family's foundation will cover it. They'll also fast-track your housing application with the city. You should be off the streets permanently within a few weeks." That last sentence landed like a warm coat over David's shoulders. A future, a home. It sounded too good to be real. He tried to steady himself against the brick wall again, unsure if it was the cold, the emotion, or the sheer surrealism of the moment making his knees buckle. He stared at Elon, stunned. This man had appeared out of nowhere, walked past him like so many others, and yet instead of moving on, he had stopped. And now he was offering a cascade of life-changing decisions as casually as someone would offer directions. David felt his throat tighten, his vision blurred, not from the cold this time, from tears that had waited far too long to be released. "But why?" he finally asked, his voice no louder than the wind. His words weren't bitter. They weren't suspicious. They were simply stunned, a whisper of disbelief wrapped in decades of survival. Elon lowered the phone from his ear, his call apparently complete. He turned to face David directly now, no technology between them, no distractions, no shields. His answer came without hesitation, "Because you reminded me what really matters." He smiled, not the kind of smile you see in boardrooms or on magazine covers, but a quiet human smile. The kind you offer someone you recognize, even if you've never met them before. "There's a lot of noise in my life," he continued. "Technology, business, deadlines, expectations. Sometimes I forget to look up, but today I did. And I saw someone who didn't ask for a handout. You asked for $1. the smallest amount you could think of. You were prepared to walk away with only that. Elon paused, his voice softening even further. But I saw more than that. I saw you reading the newspaper each morning like it still mattered. I saw you helping someone when no one else did. I saw how you keep your space clean, how you stay quiet, respectful. I saw a man holding on to his dignity when the world gave him every reason to let go. David swallowed hard, unable to speak. The words caught behind the lump in his throat, the weight of months of rejection and silence threatening to burst all at once. Elon noticed, but he didn't push. He just nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "This isn't charity," Elon said gently. "This is a choice to say, I see you, I believe in you, and I think you're worth investing in." David's hand rose slowly to his face, wiping a tear with the back of a gloved finger. His gloves were threadbare, the fabric pulling at the seams. But in this moment, they were worn by a man being seen as something more than his circumstances. He managed to whisper, "Thank you." It was all he could offer. But Elon smiled again, like it was more than enough. David couldn't help but glance at the crowd still lingering nearby. Some were watching in silent awe. Others recorded, perhaps already thinking about how many likes the footage might get. He'd spent so long being ignored that the sudden presence of so many eyes felt surreal. But now none of it mattered. For once, the attention didn't feel invasive. It felt earned. Not because he was doing anything spectacular, but because someone extraordinary had taken the time to see the humanity in something ordinary. Elon took a small envelope from inside his coat and handed it to David. Inside, he said, is your hotel confirmation, the interview location and time, and a contact card. That's a direct line to my assistant. If something falls through, if anything goes wrong, you call. Immediately. David accepted the envelope with trembling hands, holding it as though it might vanish. He nodded again, the gesture awkward, overwhelmed. Elon clapped a hand gently on his shoulder, not a PR-friendly pat, not a stage photo op. Just a hand. One person grounding another. "Get some rest," Elon said. "We'll see you at 2. And with that, he turned, his security detail falling back into formation like dancers returning to their marks. But for David, nothing would ever fall back into place quite the same way again. David couldn't stop the tears. He tried. He blinked hard, turned slightly away, even bit the inside of his cheek like he used to in the military when he needed to push emotion down. But it didn't work. The moment had already broken through the carefully constructed shell he'd worn for so many years. The tears weren't loud or dramatic. They fell silently, slipping down the lines of his weathered face, mixing with the cold air like droplets of something sacred finally released. He took a half step back, shaking his head gently, voice cracking from somewhere deep in his chest. "This is too much," he murmured, more to himself than to Elon. "I don't deserve all this." Elon didn't interrupt. He just stood there, quietly absorbing the words. He'd heard versions of them before, from inventors who thought their ideas were too small, from entrepreneurs who thought themselves unworthy of opportunity, from dreamers who'd been told too many times to stay in their place. But something in the way David said it carried a different weight. It wasn't false modesty. It was a deeply rooted belief forged from loss, from years of being told no, from a world that had slowly erased him. "You asked for $1, Elon finally said, his tone soft but resolute. "The smallest request I've ever received. But the courage it took to ask, that was enormous." David lowered his gaze again, his shoulders trembling now, not from cold, but from something deeper. Elon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, cream-colored business card. He held it out. "This has my assistant's direct number," he said. "No te quepes. If something doesn't work out, if the hotel gives you trouble, if HR doesn't follow up, if anything at all feels off, you call. Immediately." David hesitated only for a second before taking the card with both hands, as if it were something delicate and irreplaceable. He stared at the embossed name, the simple number printed in the corner. Then, in a gesture that surprised even himself, he pressed the card gently against his chest, right above the spot where his dog tag usually rested. He wasn't sure why. It was just instinct. Like holding onto a lifeline that had been thrown across a chasm he didn't even know he was allowed to cross. David started, then paused, eyes wet. He looked up, and for the first time didn't look away. Your parents, they must be very proud of you. Elon blinked, almost taken aback by the sincerity in the statement. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. A human truth, spoken without agenda. A faint smile touched the corner of Elon's mouth. I just did what anyone should do, he said quietly. David shook his head slowly, firmly. No, he said. Not anyone. Not everyone would stop. Not everyone would care. Not everyone sees. There was a pause between them, and in that space, something settled. A mutual recognition. One man who had been made invisible by life, and another who had chosen to stop and look. The sounds of the city continued on around them. Horns blaring in the distance, a train screeching underground, a coffee vendor shouting out orders. But inside this fragile moment, it all faded to the background. What remained was the stillness of being seen. The crowd had mostly thinned now, though a few lingered. The ones who had stayed weren't recording anymore. They were just watching quietly, respectfully. Something told them this wasn't a moment to be commodified. It was a moment to be honored. David looked down at the card again. It was small, flat, weightless. And yet it felt heavier than any medal he had received during his service. Because this wasn't an award for the past. It was a key to a future he had never dared imagine. I'll take care of this, he said, his voice steadier now. I won't let it go to waste. I know you won't, Elon said. There was no flourish in his voice, no grand speech. Just certainty. David smiled just a little. The first real one in a long time. The kind that didn't pull at his face like a mask, but rose from somewhere real. Thank you, Mr. Musk, he said, formally but warmly, for stopping. Elon shook his head, almost amused. Thank you, Mr. White, he replied, for speaking. They stood there for a few more seconds, as if neither quite wanted the moment to end. Then one of Elon's security guards stepped forward slightly, murmuring something in his earpiece. Elon gave him a small nod. I have to go, he said, his tone now transitioning into something more practical, more grounded in the world waiting for him. But you don't. You've got a warm bed waiting for you, and an interview at 2. David nodded. I'll be there. I know, Elon said again. I believe you. With that, he turned and began walking toward the waiting SUV at the curb. His security detail reformed around him in seconds. The bystanders parted quietly. No chairs, no fanfare, just a man who stopped to listen, and another who had finally been heard. The black SUV glided to a smooth stop in front of a grand building adorned with tall glass windows and a marble entryway. The kind of hotel David had passed by hundreds of times, but never once imagined walking into. Bellhops in crisp uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, opening doors for arriving guests, rolling luggage carts with silent wheels, and greeting every person with rehearsed warmth. But as the vehicle came to a halt and the rear door opened, something shifted. Elon leaned forward slightly from his seat across from David. His voice, as steady and grounded as it had been all morning, carried a quiet confidence that now felt familiar. Are you ready, Mr. White? David sat up straighter, adjusting his posture almost without realizing it. The coat, Elon's coat, still draped over his shoulders, its tailored fabric offering not just physical warmth, but something far more profound, protection. The lining, soft against his worn shirt, was like a barrier between the man he had been yesterday and the man he was becoming. In that moment, he wasn't a statistic or a shadow or a man who once had a life and then lost it. He was David White. And for the first time in years, he spoke with clarity, with conviction, with belief in his own voice. Yes, he said, I'm ready. It wasn't a statement of hope. It wasn't even gratitude, not yet. It was a declaration, a line in the sand, a beginning. The door opened, and David stepped out into the daylight. Snow was still lightly falling, dusting the sidewalk and the tops of taxis that lined the street. A bellhop offered to help him, But David shook his head. He had little to carry, just his backpack, worn and threadbare. Yet inside it now sat something invaluable, an envelope with a room key, directions to his interview, and a business card that could change his life. As they approached the hotel entrance, the heavy glass doors parted automatically, revealing a warm, glowing lobby. Marble floors gleamed beneath a massive chandelier. The air smelled of citrus and wood polish. David's boots, cracked and stained from years of winter, made soft thuds against the floor as he entered. At the front desk, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a welcoming smile stood waiting. She wore a name tag that read Sophia and the confidence of someone who had been briefed about something extraordinary. "Mr. White," she said, her voice pleasant and composed. "We've been expecting you." David hesitated for the briefest moment, unsure whether she was truly speaking to him. But when she stepped around the counter to greet him directly, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice still rough from the cold, but no longer uncertain. "That's me." She extended a key card with both hands, the gesture respectful. "Your room is ready. We've also arranged for a meal to be delivered in the next half hour, and there's a new suit being tailored for your interview this afternoon. If you need anything at all, just dial 0 from the phone in your room." David took the card as if it were made of glass. Something about her tone made him believe she wasn't just reading from a script. She meant every word. "Thank you," he whispered. A porter appeared beside him, ready to escort him up. But again, David declined the offer. He wanted to walk through that lobby on his own, to feel each footstep on that polished floor. This wasn't just a transition, it was a reclamation. Each step was a step away from the street, from hunger, from invisibility, and a step towards something he hadn't dared to imagine for a very long time: dignity. He passed elegant guests in tailored coats and polished shoes, some glancing curiously in his direction. But none of them stared. None of them turned up their noses. Maybe it was the coat. Maybe it was the way he held himself now. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in forever, he walked with a sense of purpose. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and David stepped in. His reflection in the gold-tinted walls startled him. His beard was overgrown, his face lined with age and struggle, but his eyes looked alive. He reached his floor and followed the porter's quiet instructions. The hallway was silent, carpeted in rich navy blue, with soft lighting casting a golden hue. "Room 1103. He held up the key card, hesitated, then slid it into the reader. The lock clicked. The door swung open with a whisper. David stepped into a room that was nothing short of luxurious. A king-size bed with crisp white linens stood in the center. There was a sitting area with a small leather couch and a coffee table, a massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and a window that looked out over the city skyline. Light poured in through sheer curtains, illuminating everything with an ethereal glow. On the bed, laid out carefully, was a small gift box wrapped in silver paper with a ribbon tied neatly across it. A note sat beside it. David unfolded it and read the words written in Elon's distinctive handwriting. "For your interview, let them see the man I met today." David opened the box to find a dress shirt, a silk tie, and a pair of cufflinks shaped like tiny rockets. Simple, thoughtful, perfect. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave gently under his weight. He reached up and touched the collar of the coat, still draped over his shoulders, then looked around the room. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't luck. This was what it felt like to be seen, to be given a second chance. And as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling, he felt something unfamiliar swell in his chest. Not fear, not shame, not doubt. It was the beginning of a return. To stability, to worth, to himself. David stepped slowly into the hotel room's bathroom, the plush carpet giving way to cool tiles beneath his feet. The space was immaculate, gleaming chrome fixtures, spotless mirrors, and soft lighting that made the entire room glow with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For a long moment, he just stood there in front of the mirror, unmoving. The man staring back at him wasn't a stranger, but he wasn't entirely familiar either. The deep lines across his forehead, the sunken cheeks, the heavy eyes, those had become his normal. A face molded by weather and grief, by silence and survival. But beneath all that, beneath the hollow fatigue and the long shadow of the streets, there was something else. Hope. He hadn't seen it in himself for a long time. Not since before the layoff. Not since the hospital bills came. Not since Sarah and Lily's laughter stopped echoing through the apartment. But now, as he looked into the mirror, something glimmered behind his eyes. It wasn't youth. It wasn't confidence. It was possibility. He reached for the faucet, turned the handle, and listened to the hiss of life returning to his fingertips. Steam began to rise, curling in soft tendrils that filled the room. David hesitated only a second longer before peeling off the layers of dirt-stiff clothing, coats and shirts that felt more like armor than garments, and stepping into the shower. The first blast of hot water stole his breath. For the first few seconds, it hurt. His skin, so used to the bite of wind and the sting of cold, reacted with a shock that almost sent him stepping backward. But he stayed. And slowly, the warmth began to soothe instead of scald. His hands pressed against the tiles as the water poured over him, washing away not just the grime of the past few days, but something heavier, something older. Dirt swirled down the drain. But so did other things: shame, loneliness, doubt. David stood under the stream for a long time, longer than he'd planned. He let the water run down his back, over the curve of his shoulders, down the spine that had carried the weight of more than one life. When he finally turned the faucet off, the silence was thick and peaceful. He stepped out, wrapped himself in a white hotel robe so soft it felt like a cloud, and dried his face gently with a towel that smelled like lemon and lavender. He walked back into the room and found the gift box waiting where he'd left it, resting beside a tray covered in a silver dome. Lifting the lid revealed a steaming plate, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables still vibrant with color, and a buttered roll. There was even a slice of chocolate cake on the side. The scent made his stomach growl, so loudly that he laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like a decade. He sat at the small dining table by the window, pulled the chair out slowly, and took the first bite. Warm, savory, real. A meal meant for someone who mattered. When he finished, he opened the box. Inside was a perfectly pressed charcoal gray suit, simple but dignified. A crisp white shirt, a navy tie, and at the bottom, a small case containing 2 silver cufflinks shaped like rockets. Elon's signature, perhaps, or maybe just a quiet gesture of connection between 2 men from distant worlds. David took a breath, then stood and began to dress. He moved slowly, carefully, reverently. He hadn't worn a suit in years, not since his last security post at the courthouse. Even then, the uniforms had been functional, not stylish. This was different. This suit wasn't about blending in. It was about being seen. With each layer, something changed. The man in the mirror shifted. The lines didn't disappear, and the eyes were still tired, but there was something new there, something stronger. By the time he fastened the last button and slipped the cufflinks into place, David barely recognized himself. He looked taller, straighter, not just because of the clothing, but because of what the clothing represented. A door opening, a chance earned, a tomorrow worth waking up for. He turned and picked up the card Elon had given him. He ran his fingers across the embossed lettering, the simple but powerful phone number printed beneath. It felt weighty in his hand, like a passport out of something. A bridge between the life he had been living and the one he might reclaim. He slipped the card into the inside pocket of the suit jacket and stood still for a moment, taking it all in. "I'm still here," he whispered to the room. "And life isn't over." It wasn't meant to be poetic. It wasn't meant for anyone to hear. But saying it out loud made it real. David stepped to the window. Outside, the city bustled on, people hurrying down sidewalks, cabs honking, snow continuing to fall in soft flakes. It was the same New York he had known for years. And yet, it looked entirely different from 11 floors up. Behind him, the suit fit his frame with quiet precision. In front of him, the street stretched into possibility. He thought of Elon, of the moment their eyes met, of the calm voice that cut through a noisy world to say, "Give us a moment." He thought of the coat still hanging beside the door, and the conversation that changed everything. But more than anything, he thought of Lily, his daughter, and the way she used to say, "We help because we can." And now someone had helped him. Not out of pity, not for attention, but because they saw a man worth saving. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start seeing himself that way, too. At exactly 2 p.m., a black town car pulled up to the main entrance of the SpaceX regional headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. A sleek, modern building of glass and steel, it towered above the surrounding architecture like a monument to possibility. The mirrored facade reflected the bustling city around it, but what stood out most in that reflection was not the building itself. It was the man stepping toward its doors. David White adjusted his navy tie with fingers that trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the surreal gravity of it all. The charcoal gray suit fit him perfectly, tailored that very morning. The silver rocket-shaped cufflinks caught the afternoon sun, gleaming like badges of honor. His posture, upright and focused, echoed a version of himself he hadn't seen in over a decade. A version before hospitals and loss, before cardboard bedding and cold stares. A version who stood for something, who believed again in forward motion. As he stepped through the revolving doors, a gust of warm, filtered air replaced the chill outside. The lobby was vast and clean, with a minimalist aesthetic, brushed steel, white marble, subtle lighting that curved beneath the edges of floating ceilings. The SpaceX logo glowed on the far wall in crisp white letters, understated yet powerful. The kind of room that said without words, "We don't have to prove anything. We're already doing it." David approached the front desk. A young woman with a headset and a warm but efficient demeanor looked up. Her eyes flickered briefly over the ID badge clipped to his lapel and the appointment confirmation he held. "Mr. White?" she asked. He nodded, standing tall. "Yes, ma'am. Here for the 2 o'clock with security operations." "Of course. They're expecting you." She typed quickly, then gestured toward a side elevator. "You'll be going to the 34th floor. Just tap your badge. They'll meet you there." "Thank you." He turned toward the elevator bay, his shoes clicking with quiet certainty across the polished floor. As he stepped inside, the mirrored walls of the elevator reflected him from every angle. He barely recognized the man staring back, not because the reflection was foreign, but because it finally felt earned. This wasn't a disguise or a borrowed moment. It was who he had always been, waiting to emerge again. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top. When the doors slid open, David was met by a man in a crisp black suit with a SpaceX security insignia pinned to the chest. He extended a hand. "Mr. White, welcome. Right this way." They walked down a quiet hallway with glass-walled offices on either side. The city skyline stretched out beyond, a breathtaking backdrop to a space that pulsed with vision and clarity. Engineers moved through the corridors with tablets in hand. Quiet conversations echoed softly, focused and purposeful. David was led into a mid-sized conference room. It was professional but not intimidating. A circular table dominated the center, surrounded by ergonomic chairs. On the far wall was a live screen showing footage from various launch sites and logistics hubs. The air smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. Seated at the table were 2 people. A woman in her late 40s with silver streaks in her dark hair and a posture that radiated authority, and a younger man with alert eyes and a military haircut. Beside them stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, mid-50s, African-American, wearing a name tag that read Hayes, Director of Security. He stepped forward as David entered. "Captain White," Hayes said with a nod. "It's an honor." David returned the gesture. "Likewise." They motioned for him to sit, and the interview began. It wasn't what he expected. There were no trick questions, no corporate jargon, no cold bureaucracy. Instead, the conversation was grounded, honest, and clear. "Your military record is extensive," said the woman, flipping through a file. 20 years, Gulf War veteran, multiple commendations. Your time in civilian security, also shows a consistent pattern of leadership and calm under pressure. Thank you, David said simply. The younger man leaned forward. What we're really trying to understand is, are you ready to come back to this kind of environment? Fast-paced, high expectations. It's not light work, at least not mentally. David met his gaze directly. More than ever, he said. I've been out of the game, yes, but not by choice. My mind's still sharp. My instincts haven't dulled. If anything, what I've been through has only made me more resilient. The woman raised an eyebrow, impressed. You're confident? No, ma'am, David replied. I'm prepared. That's different. There was a moment of silence in the room, the kind that carries respect rather than tension. Hayes finally spoke again, folding his arms. You know, when Elon told me to keep an open slot for someone, I didn't know what to expect. But after this conversation, I'm glad I did. David blinked. He called ahead. Hayes smiled. Let's just say he believes in you. That means something around here. David sat back slightly, absorbing the weight of those words. Not long ago, he was a man surviving on the edges. Now, someone at the center had placed trust in him, without conditions. The rest of the meeting covered logistics, background checks, onboarding, start dates, insurance, scheduling flexibility for medical follow-ups. It was all real, tangible, a roadmap back to stability. As the meeting drew to a close, Hayes stood and extended his hand again. Captain, it's been a pleasure. We'll finalize the paperwork this week. Welcome back. David took the handshake firmly, but there was a tremble in his fingers that had nothing to do with nerves. It was adrenaline, relief, gratitude. As he exited the room and walked back down the hall toward the elevator, the mirrored walls greeted him once again. This time, he didn't hesitate to look. He saw a man in a suit standing tall, but more importantly, he saw a man restored. Back at the hotel, David stood just inside the doorway of room 1103, holding the plastic key card between his fingers like it was made of porcelain. It felt strange to have a room, his room. He turned the card over slowly, reading the printed number again, grounding himself in the moment. After months of drifting between shelters, stoops, and subway benches, he had an address. An actual address. For numbers on a door, backed by heat, light, privacy, and the simplest, most radical gift of all, safety. He closed the door behind him gently. The muted click of a latch felt final, like closing the chapter on an unspoken kind of suffering. No doorman would chase him off this doorstep. No night patrol would shine flashlights in his face here. This place belonged to him, if only for now. And that was enough. David shrugged off the suit jacket with care, hanging it over the back of a nearby chair. The fabric still carried the weight of the interview, the handshake, the quiet validation. He loosened the tie with trembling fingers, the adrenaline of the day finally starting to settle. His reflection caught in the window pane, half city, half man, and for a moment he just stared. He looked well. Not flawless, not polished like the executives or the political figures who grace the news, but whole. And that was new. He filled the kettle with water, placed it on the burner, and reached for one of the complimentary tea sachets on the side table, chamomile. His hands still bore the calluses of years spent gripping too tightly to too little, but now they moved with calm, no longer twitching from cold or hunger. As the tea steeped, he turned on the television. Not for the noise or to distract himself, but because he could. He flipped past cable news, sports, a baking show, and stopped on a channel showing a live aerial view of the Manhattan skyline, softly lit in the evening haze. He carried the steaming mug to the armchair beside the window and sank into its cushion with a groan he hadn't let out in years. The kind of groan that came from bones remembering what rest felt like. His back relaxed, legs stretched out. The lights of the city flickered across the window, twinkling like a theater curtain about to rise. Outside, taxis honked in traffic below. Buses sighed at curbs. A man in a business coat rushed down the street, phone glued to his ear. The city moved on like it always did, indifferent, alive, brilliant. And yet, something had shifted. Not in the world. In him. Because now, David White was no longer part of the sidewalk. He was no longer a face people passed by, avoided, ignored. He was no longer a ghost wrapped in layers of charity and neglect. He had re-entered the story. He wasn't invisible anymore. And it hadn't taken a miracle. It hadn't taken a rescue mission or an intervention. It had taken a moment, one question, one simple human exchange. Can you spare $1? And a man, not just any man, but a man with power, with reach, with every reason to walk past, had listened. That was the start of it. Not the dollar, not the coat, not even the hotel room. It was the listening. David wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his palms. He looked down at the business card still tucked into his wallet. Elon's assistant's number. A lifeline that didn't just offer help, it offered belief. He didn't know if the job would be permanent, if the housing would come through, if the next weeks would be smooth. Life wasn't tidy like that. But he did know something had fundamentally changed. He had stepped off the curb. He had spoken, and someone had answered. The TV buzzed softly in the background, but his focus remained outside the window. The city, he realized, had never looked so alive, not just because of the lights or the motion, but because he finally saw himself within it. He was no longer just observing life from the fringes. He was back inside the frame. And he carried names with him, Sarah, Lily, who would have told him, had they been there, we knew you would come back. Tears threatened again, but this time he welcomed them. Tonight, he would sleep in a real bed, on clean sheets beneath a warm comforter with a locked door and a quiet room. But that wasn't what brought him peace. What truly quieted the storm inside him was something far deeper. He would sleep with a name, with his dignity intact, with hope not just for tomorrow, but for the kind of life that had seemed irretrievable just days ago. David reached for the remote and turned off the TV. He finished his tea in silence. Then he stood, walked over to the bed, and pulled back the covers. As he slipped beneath them, he whispered aloud, not to himself, but to the darkness beyond the window. Thank you. It wasn't just for Elon. It was for the moment that reminded him who he was, and gave him permission to believe again. The next morning, David rose before the alarm on the hotel room's nightstand had a chance to buzz. He had slept more deeply than he had in months, perhaps years, but the rhythm of years spent rising early had never left his bones. Sunlight peeked through the curtains, soft and golden, casting long slats of warmth across the carpeted floor. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, stretching slowly, letting the silence sink in. No noise of the street, no cold biting at his skin. Just quiet, steady morning light, and the knowledge that today, for once, he had somewhere important to be. By 9 a.m., he was dressed again in the same suit, still pressed and clean from the day before. He adjusted the cuffs, tucked Elon's card carefully back into his wallet, and stepped out into the morning air with a clear sense of direction. A Tesla was waiting outside the hotel, just as promised. The driver, a young man with a polite smile and a quiet professionalism, opened the door without fanfare. It was just another part of the arrangement now, normal, as though David had always belonged to this world. The Manhattan VA Medical Center loomed tall and familiar as the car pulled into the drop-off lane. It wasn't David's first time here, but something about walking in today felt entirely different. This time, he wasn't lost in a bureaucratic fog. He wasn't here to plead for attention or sit for hours in the hope of being squeezed into someone's schedule. He had an appointment, a name on a list, a purpose. As he approached the front desk, a nurse in navy scrubs looked up and smiled. Captain White. He nodded, surprised to be addressed with his rank. Yes, ma'am. Right this way. The team is expecting you. The team. The words echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a visit. It was a coordinated effort. Someone, Elon, he knew without question, had called ahead, not only to schedule the visit, but to make sure David was treated with the same dignity he had once worn in uniform. He was led down a clean corridor with bright lights and polished floors, past framed photos of veterans in service and quiet waiting rooms. But David didn't wait long. He was ushered directly into a private consultation room where 3 medical professionals stood waiting, a general physician, a cardiologist, and nurse practitioner. "Good morning, Captain," said the cardiologist, a calm, silver-haired man with warm eyes and a clipboard. "We've reviewed your previous records and want to run a few tests today. We'll take blood work, update your imaging, and go over your medications. We want to make sure we're treating the right condition with the right tools." David nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. He wasn't being brushed off or given half answers. They were speaking to him, not at him. The tests took a few hours: blood draws, an echocardiogram, a stress test he wasn't exactly thrilled about, but at every step, the staff moved with a mix of urgency and care. They explained everything, asked for his consent, even offered him a bottle of water and a snack when he sat to rest afterward. When the cardiologist returned with initial results, he didn't sugarcoat anything. "Your heart's been under stress for a long time. Left untreated, this could have become very serious. But with medication, rest, and regular monitoring, there's no reason you can't have many more years ahead. Healthy, mobile, independent." David let out a slow breath. It was the first time in years someone had told him he wasn't running out of time. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Really?" The doctor smiled. "Thank Elon. He called in personally. Said you were starting a new chapter. We just want to make sure your health keeps pace with that." David left the hospital with a full printout of his treatment plan in a folder under his arm. His prescriptions had been refilled, his next round of checkups scheduled for the following week, and his medical history finally organized under a consistent care team. But more than that, he walked out with his head high, not just because of what he'd received, but because of what it meant. For years, his health had been a silent weight dragging behind him. Something to ignore, to minimize, to delay. He had accepted pain as normal, dizziness as expected, fatigue as a given. There had always been more pressing needs: food, shelter, basic survival. Doctors had seemed like a luxury, treatment a dream. But now everything had changed, because someone had made a phone call, because someone had looked at him on a sidewalk and seen a man worth saving, not just from the cold, but from slow, invisible decay. Back outside, the winter wind was brisk, but not unbearable. David zipped his coat higher and looked up at the building's facade. He touched the folder lightly with one hand, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card once more. It felt heavier today, not because of what it represented in money or connections, but because it now held proof. Proof that follow-through was real, that promises could be kept, that not every act of kindness was performative. Some, like this one, carried into the next day, into the next breath. David stood at the curb for a moment, watching a few others come and go from the VA's revolving doors. A man in a wheelchair with a knit cap and navy patches on his jacket. A woman with a cane and stack of documents tucked under her arm. Each of them navigating the same system David had for years: slow, uncertain, underfunded. He didn't feel guilt, but he did feel responsibility. A responsibility to not waste what he'd been given. A sense that maybe once he was back on his feet, he could help someone else find their way to the door. Maybe even stand outside one cold morning and guide them in. He smiled softly, then flagged down the waiting Tesla. As he stepped inside, he felt the weight of the day settle gently on his shoulders, not like a burden, but like a mantle. This was his second chance, and this time he would carry it well. By the end of his third week at SpaceX, David White had begun arriving a little earlier to the office each morning, not because it was required, but because he wanted to walk through the city while it was still half asleep. There was something comforting about the quiet just before sunrise, when the air was cold and sharp, and the only sounds were the echo of footsteps and the hiss of delivery trucks. It reminded him of the old days on base, when the world hadn't yet begun to stir and there was space to think. But this wasn't just about routine or nostalgia. David was doing something more deliberate now. With each early walk, he took a slightly different route, seeking not the polished sidewalks of Midtown, but the forgotten alleys and corners of the city where he used to spend his nights. He wasn't searching for anything specific, but he was looking for someone like he had once been. It had started the week prior. He'd passed a man slouched against a closed storefront near Lexington, a tattered military patch barely visible on the jacket sleeve. David stopped, Didn't ask questions. Just sat beside him, talked, asked his name, told him where to find a warm meal that wouldn't ask for anything in return, slipped him a folded paper with a list of veteran resource centers and a prepaid phone card clipped inside. No grand gestures, just presence. The man hadn't cried, hadn't thanked him. But when David stood and offered a handshake, the man had taken it with both hands and held on for a moment too long. Since then, it had become a quiet mission. Not charity, not saviorism, just connection. Late one Friday evening, after finishing a final debrief with the night shift team, David walked a few extra blocks before catching the train home. The city had turned colder again, the kind of night where the wind seemed to sneak beneath your skin, no matter how many layers you wore. He passed a coffee shop closing down, the scent of espresso mixing with the distant smell of snow in the air. And then he saw him. Tucked between a dumpster and the brick wall of a quiet alley was a young man, maybe in his late 20s. His boots were military issue, though worn to shreds. His coat was thin and poorly fastened. He slept in a huddle, knees to his chest, arms wrapped around a small backpack that served as both pillow and vault. David hesitated for a moment, heart tightening. He knew this scene too well. He'd been this scene. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer and lowered himself to the concrete nearby, his joints protesting the motion. He didn't speak right away, just sat, letting the moment breathe. After a minute, the young man stirred, sensing another presence. He jolted awake slightly, his body tense. But David didn't move. "Easy," he said gently. "You're safe." The young man's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a plain white card. On it was his name, a number, and nothing else. "Name's David," he said. "I work security now. But not long ago, I was out here too." The young man eyed him skeptically. "You were homeless." "For almost a year." The two sat in silence for a beat, the sounds of the city murmuring around them. David looked up at the sliver of night sky above the buildings, then back at the man beside him. "I'm not here to fix your life," he said. "I'm not going to preach. But if you want help, just a start, not a handout, call that number. It goes directly to me." He placed the card beside the man's bag, not expecting him to take it right away. The young man looked away, but his voice cracked slightly. "Why are you doing this?" David's answer was quiet. "Because someone once stopped for me. One person. On a cold morning like this, when I thought no one ever would. And that moment changed everything." He paused, then added, "He didn't try to save me. He just saw me, gave me one push, and that was enough." The young man didn't say anything, but he didn't tell David to leave either. So they sat together a while longer, two men, two generations of service, bound not just by uniforms, but by the aftermath. Eventually, David stood. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And if you want to talk, even just to talk, I'm here." As he turned to walk away, he heard a voice behind him. "What was his name?" the young man asked. David smiled without turning around. "Elon." The name hung in the air for a moment, somewhere between legend and mystery. David kept walking, his hands in his coat pockets, the cold less biting than before. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he trusted the moment to do its work. Sometimes that was all it took. A voice, a gesture, a story offered like a bridge. In the following weeks, more moments like that happened. Sometimes it was just a conversation over coffee. Sometimes it was a quiet donation to a shelter under a different name. Sometimes it was standing in line with a man who didn't want to walk into the VA alone. David didn't tell many people. He wasn't doing it for recognition. It wasn't about debt either, not really. It was about balance, about taking the good he'd received and letting it multiply. The kindness he'd been shown had never been meant to stop with him. It was a torch, and now he carried it forward, offering a flame to those still stumbling in the dark. He couldn't change the whole world, but he could light up one corner of it at a time. And sometimes he thought that was more than enough. Days later, David stood before the towering entrance of the SpaceX facility, his shoulders squared beneath a freshly tailored blazer, his breath visible in the morning chill. He reached into his coat and pulled out his ID badge, shiny, laminated, and clipped to a sturdy black lanyard. The photo, recently taken, showed a man reborn. Still rugged, still weathered, but with eyes that looked forward now, not down. David White, security consultant, it read. The title alone felt surreal. He stepped through the automatic doors, greeted the front desk receptionist with a familiar nod, and tapped his badge against the reader. A soft beep, a green light, and he was inside, not as a guest, not as a favor, but as a colleague. His first day had been a whirlwind of orientation, paperwork, and shaking hands. But now, just a few days into his new routine, David moved through the halls with the calm assurance of someone who belonged. The uniform wasn't standard issue anymore. It was confidence, discipline, experience. He wasn't just part of security team. He was the team's cornerstone, a man with a voice that carried weight. In the mornings, he led training sessions for younger recruits, many of them fresh out of college, a few from military backgrounds like his. They called him Captain, after learning about his past, and though he told them to just use his name, the respect in their voices was something he didn't correct. He taught them more than procedures and protocols. He told them about staying calm during panic drills, about reading the room during VIP visits, about understanding why security existed, not to intimidate but to protect. Between sessions, he sat in meetings with other consultants and supervisors, reviewing surveillance layouts and threat response simulations. He contributed ideas, listened carefully, and spoke up when he felt something was being overlooked. His suggestions were thoughtful, not loud, grounded in decades of fieldwork, not ego. Slowly, the others began deferring to him more and more. He didn't need to fight for a seat at the table. He'd earned it by simply showing up as himself. The best part, though, came in the quiet moments. The young woman who asked him over lunch about his transition back to civilian life, the new guard who approached him after a briefing to say he'd served in Iraq and hadn't told anyone until now, the intern who admitted that seeing someone like David in the building gave him hope that experience still mattered in a world obsessed with innovation. And every time David entered the lobby, scanned his badge, and stepped through the glass doors of that gleaming skyscraper, he felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. I made it back, he would think. I didn't disappear. On the morning of his 10th day, as he finished reviewing a new access policy for the executive floor, he heard a ripple of murmured voices near the main entrance. The staff subtly straightened their posture. Phones were tucked away. The energy shifted. He didn't have to ask. Elon Musk had arrived. David stood near the security checkpoint as Elon stepped through, flanked by his usual discreet security team. The billionaire's presence was magnetic but relaxed, as if he were walking into his garage rather than a multi-billion-dollar company. Elon glanced around, taking in the space, the people, the flow of the day. Then his eyes landed on David. He broke away from his group without hesitation. "Mr. White," Elon said with that signature dry smile. "How's the second week treating you?" David stepped forward and offered his hand. His grip was firm, more than a handshake. It was a statement of gratitude, of steady footing. "Better than I could have imagined," he said. Elon's eyes flicked down to the badge hanging around David's neck, and then back up. "Looks good on you." David smiled, the kind that came slowly but reached his eyes. "It feels right. Like I've found the part of me I thought I'd lost." Elon nodded, studying him not like a CEO evaluating an employee, but like a man recognizing another who had walked a difficult road and come out the other side. "I didn't do much," Elon said, shrugging. "I just gave a push. You're the one who kept walking." David paused, reflecting on that. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said quietly. "One push. One person who sees you." Elon tilted his head thoughtfully. "Then maybe you'll be the one doing the pushing next time." David met his gaze. "I plan to." A brief silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but rich with meaning. Then Elon clapped him on the shoulder once, firmly. "Good to see you, David. Let me know if you need anything." And just like that, he turned, rejoining his team, moving deeper into the building. But the conversation stayed with David like the weight of something valuable in his pocket. Later that afternoon, during a training session with a group of new hires, David shared a piece of advice he hadn't intended to. It just came out. "Don't underestimate a moment," he said. "You never know what someone's carrying when they walk through that door. Pay attention. Stay human. We're not just here to enforce rules. We're here to protect people. That means something." They nodded, scribbled notes. But one or two looked up and really saw him, and David knew those words would stay with him. He finished the day with his usual final round, checking equipment storage, logging incident reports, saying goodnight to the front desk staff by name. As he walked through the lobby once more, he paused by the tall windows, looking out at the city below. The same city that once made him feel invisible now looked different. It hadn't changed. He had. And as he tapped his badge one last time and stepped through the revolving door into the winter air, David White carried with him not just a job or a paycheck or a new suit. He carried purpose and the quiet conviction that someday soon, someone else would need a hand, and he'd be ready to offer it. Time moved forward as it always does. The seasons changed. Winter's icy grip gave way to the reluctant thaw of spring, then to the humid buzz of summer. With each passing day, David White pieced together a life that had once felt irreparably lost. It wasn't a perfect life, not by any means. There were still days when shadows lingered, when the memories crept in, when the old doubts tapped on the window like rain on glass. But now, there was something stronger holding it all together: purpose. His work at SpaceX became more than a job. It was a rhythm, a return to discipline, and a canvas for mentorship. Young recruits sought him out during breaks. His name started floating in internal newsletters, usually accompanied by phrases like "an asset to the team" or "quiet leadership." But David never chased titles. He measured his success in something quieter: the handshakes, the nods in the hallway, the quiet thank yous he received from new hires who felt seen for the first time in a place full of stars. Outside of work, his commitment to fellow veterans expanded. He volunteered twice a week with a reintegration program, quietly funding meals, reviewing resumes, and sometimes just sitting beside someone who hadn't spoken to another soul in days. He never forgot the cold sting of being invisible. He knew what it meant to have someone say your name with warmth, not pity. And people started to notice. A journalist from a major network reached out, having heard whispers of his story. At first, David declined. He didn't want to be paraded as a success case or turned into a headline. But the journalist persisted, not for sensation, she said, but because people needed to hear something real. With some hesitation, David agreed. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. It was quiet and deeply human. Footage showed David at work, leading a training session. Then a shot of him sharing coffee with a younger veteran outside a shelter. He didn't dramatize anything in the interview. He simply told the truth. "I was broken," he said on camera. "Not because I failed, but because life doesn't always give you time to recover. I didn't ask for pity. I just asked for $1. And someone listened." The clip made its way to millions. But the moment that truly set the world buzzing came days later, during a panel discussion Elon Musk attended at a global tech summit in San Francisco. Dressed in his usual understated style, Elon took the stage alongside other CEOs to discuss the future of innovation and leadership. Toward the end of the session, a moderator turned the questions to personal topics. "You've changed the way we think about space, transport, energy. But I want to ask you about something else," she said, pausing as a photograph appeared on the screen. Elon and David shaking hands in the lobby of SpaceX. "Why did you stop for him that day?" the moderator asked. The audience hushed. Elon leaned into the microphone, his tone even. "Because he asked." A soft murmur moved through the crowd. "But more than that," he continued, "I stopped because I saw someone. I didn't see a statistic or a problem to fix. I saw a man, sharp eyes, steady voice, military ID clipped to his chest. Someone who'd lived. Someone the world tried very hard to forget." He paused again, then added almost offhandedly, "That moment changed me too." The clip went viral in under an hour. It wasn't the first time Elon had been in headlines, but this was different. This wasn't about stock prices or Mars colonies. It was about something smaller and bigger, something human. The clip was shared across platforms with captions like, "Compassion isn't innovation, but it might be more powerful." Or $1, one question, a world of change. David White's name began appearing in places he never imagined. Not for what he had achieved with wealth or fame, but for what he had survived and who he had become afterward. Schools invited him to speak. Veteran organizations reached out. A publisher offered him a book deal, which he politely declined, saying, "I'm still writing my story." But his impact rippled, not just through the lives he touched directly, but through the thousands of people inspired by his journey. People who stopped to look around them. People who realized that sometimes being a hero didn't require billions or a platform, just the willingness to pause and say, "I see you." David remained humble through it all. He still took the subway most days, still carried a simple leather-bound notebook where he jotted down names and stories. And every so often, he would revisit that same corner where it all began. Not to relive the past, but to remind himself of the power of a single moment, of a choice. He kept the original business card Elon gave him in his wallet, though it was worn now, the ink slightly faded at the edges. He never needed to call the number again, but he kept it as a symbol, not of who helped him, but of what happens when help is offered without hesitation. On one particularly cold morning, as David passed a newsstand, he caught sight of a magazine cover featuring Elon. The caption read, "Visionary of the Century." Beneath it, in smaller print, "Even visionaries need reminders of what really matters." David smiled softly and kept walking, because he knew, for all the rockets launched, for all the dreams chased among the stars, sometimes the most powerful journey is the one that brings a man back to himself. And all it took was a single, trembling question. Can you spare $1? It was never really about the money. It was about being seen. And in that moment, both men, one from a boardroom and one from a sidewalk, stepped into something neither of them would ever forget. Humanity, shared, restored, returned. If this story moved you, even just a little, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from? And more than that, have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment like this? A small gesture that ended up meaning everything? Drop it in the comments. It doesn't have to be long or polished, just real. Because sometimes your story might be the push someone else needs today.